The Supreme Court has just issued a landmark decision, curbing the influence of activist judges and restoring balance to the judiciary. Justice Barrett's decisive action marks a significant return to constitutional principles. Breaking news today.
Hello, and welcome to That News Show, where we discuss the latest facts, fakes, and hypocrisy as reported by the legacy media. Let's roll the tape.
Justice Barrett's opinion extends beyond legal reasoning. It serves as a warning against activist courts and the globalist agenda that has eroded American sovereignty for years. MSNBC reports that the gloves are off. Analysts are reacting to Barrett's sharp critique of Justice Jackson in the Birthright ruling. For the first time in decades, the Supreme Court has affirmed that unelected judges cannot override the will of the people, not universally at least. Perhaps the real issue is that someone in Washington is finally advocating for the nation's borders, its laws, and indeed its citizens. Predictably, some on the left are decrying this as the death of democracy. Let the show begin.
And so the court implied that perhaps the injunction should not extend to those states and children born within them, which means that there could be an underclass, a new caste of newborns in 30 days who are stripped of American citizenship, even though it is their birthright under the 14th Amendment, and who are rendered deportable and quite possibly stateless from the moment they join this earth, which is a really startling and jarring outcome that the court barely bothers to.
The Supreme Court's recent decision to limit nationwide injunctions represents a significant shift in federal court dynamics, particularly concerning executive actions on critical issues like birthright citizenship. This correction, championed by the conservative majority under Justice Barrett, underscores the court's role in resolving specific cases and controversies, not legislating from the bench. Critics, especially from the left, have voiced concerns predicting the emergence of a stateless underclass. The court's focus was not on the constitutionality of birthright citizenship itself, but on whether a single district judge should have the authority to halt a presidential order nationwide. It reaffirms that American citizenship should be governed by established laws rather than the whims of judges or international bodies. The recent ruling aims to curb this misuse, reinforcing that judicial powers are confined within the boundaries set by Congress and the Constitution. The core issue here is the appropriateness of unelected judges dictating national policy often influenced by ideological biases. This move restores a constitutional balance that had been undermined by decades of judicial overreach, where lower courts often blocked presidential policies across all states based on minimal claims. The debate over birthright citizenship is far from over, but it will now proceed within the constitutional framework, not through judicial overreach. The dissenting opinions that warn of gamesmanship and irreparable harm seem less credible when considering the previous administration's disregard for unfavorable court decisions. There is a valid concern about potential confusion as the order takes effect variably across states. Now that the roles are reversed, the outcry appears inconsistent. This practice, widespread during the previous Democratic administration, saw judges using universal injunctions to block policies contrary to their views, from immigration to religious freedoms.
But in a concurrence, Justice Alito, joined by Justice Thomas, warned that courts should not replace universal injunctions with class actions, that that's too much of a stretch as well, and that these kinds of relief should still be limited to individual plaintiffs. And if the lower courts are bound by that rule, then in 30 days, we are going to have, for the first time since before the Civil War, a new underclass of babies born of immigrants who are stripped of one of the most fundamental rights there is.
For decades, activist judges, particularly during the previous Democratic administration, have used nationwide injunctions to halt policies they opposed, leading to a mosaic of conflicting decisions and allowing unelected judges to effectively set national policy. Justice Alito, supported by Justice Thomas, issued a crucial warning in his concurrence. Lower courts should avoid replacing universal injunctions with broad class actions as a mere workaround. Such actions would constitute judicial overreach, undermining the constitutional boundaries that the Supreme Court has reinforced. Alito and Thomas rightly expressed skepticism about class actions becoming the next avenue for judicial activism. If courts merely replace one oversized remedy with another, we achieve no real change. The court's recent decision emphasizes that relief should be specific to individual plaintiffs rather than applied as a general policy across the country. The partisan split is evident. Democrats often see the courts as a safeguard for their policy goals, while Republicans, along with an increasing number of independents, advocate for a strict adherence to the rule of law and respect for the separation of powers. This shift is a necessary correction, not a crisis, reminding us that the judiciary is not the ultimate authority in our constitutional framework. Looking ahead, it falls to Congress to address the issues highlighted by this ruling if there is genuine bipartisan intent to do so. This situation marks a return to constitutional order, where Congress legislates, the executive enforces, and the courts resolve actual disputes between real parties, not imagined ones. This decision is part of a broader movement to restore checks and balances, countering years of judicial overreach and affirming constitutional governance and American sovereignty. The core issue, whether the executive order on birthright citizenship is lawful, remains unresolved, with legal challenges continuing in nearly half the states. If there are genuine concerns about families affected, it is Congress's responsibility to address these through legislation, not for judges to assume new powers.
It's very personal, and I think it's extraordinarily disrespectful and inappropriate from Justice Barrett, who touts herself as being collegial and professorial, but in this case clearly felt wounded by Justice Jackson's...
The recent Supreme Court decision that limits nationwide injunctions has ignited a fierce debate. Justice Barrett's sharp criticism of Justice Jackson's dissent has been perceived by some as a breach of judicial decorum, while others commend it as a defense of constitutional principles against judicial overreach. Critics argue that this ruling may result in inconsistent legal enforcement across states, potentially leading to humanitarian issues. The network's reliance on expert opinions, such as those from Georgetown law professor Michelle Goodwin, enriches their narrative, but also suggests a preference for living constitutionalism. The decision marks a critical move towards rebalancing the powers of government branches, curtailing the ability of lower courts to issue broad injunctions that impact non-parties. Their visual storytelling poignantly highlights the emotional toll on immigrant communities, yet it leans towards advocacy journalism, aligning with their progressive editorial stance, a stark contrast to Fox News' conservative approach. The network's focus on the potential for administrative gamesmanship and the diminishing of judicial oversight over executive actions has sparked discussions about bias in media coverage.
Majority. It's one of several dissents she published this term where she accused the supermajority on the right of bias toward the Trump administration, of surrendering the rule of law so that Trump can rule like a king, of essentially degrading our constitutional democracy and turning it into a monarchy that Trump can rule by himself. And she's saying not just that the majority is doing this by accident, that it's stumbling into this, but that it's doing it on purpose, because this is how the majority sees the country, that they really believe Trump should rule it with no limits.
By curbing the scope of judicial remedies, the court is prompting Congress to take up its legislative role on contentious issues like immigration and citizenship. The accusations that the court's majority is deliberately dismantling constitutional checks to grant President Trump unchecked power are unfounded. The ruling does not grant the president unlimited power. Rather, it limits the judiciary from imposing broad remedies without a solid legal basis. The decision at hand is not about endorsing executive overreach, but restoring the judiciary's proper role, one that respects the limits set by the Constitution and Congress. Families and local governments will now navigate a confusing mix of citizenship standards, causing administrative headaches for hospitals, schools, and businesses as they adjust to new federal documentation guidelines. Overall, this ruling marks a step toward rebalancing government branches and reaffirming American sovereignty against globalist influences. This approach prevents unelected judges from dictating national policy and is supported by 2 centuries of legal precedent, ensuring that courts resolve actual disputes rather than acting as super-legislatures. For employers, the end of nationwide injunctions reduces regulatory uncertainty and the impact of abrupt policy changes on areas like immigration and labor. This decision reinforces the separation of powers and guards against the type of judicial overreach common in the previous administration. This shift away from judicial activism, which often favored progressive causes, realigns with the voters' will and encourages a healthier democratic process. The dissent's fears of a slide into monarchy or the creation of a stateless underclass are overblown. It sends a clear message. Genuine policy concerns should be addressed by Congress through the legislative process, reflecting the proper functioning of a constitutional republic. As always, it's interesting to hear how they like to spin this. Now, with President Trump back in office, we're seeing a restoration of sanity, adherence to the rule of law, reaffirmation of national sovereignty, and a government that genuinely serves its people. Tonight, we witnessed the Supreme Court take a stand against the unchecked power of activist judges, a trend previously endorsed and even celebrated by the last Democratic administration. The real danger to democracy is not a court that upholds the Constitution, but rather the continuous efforts by some elites to undermine it. For years, leaders like Biden and Harris portrayed national borders and constitutional order as outdated barriers to their globalist agenda. Why is it that whenever Americans seek to reclaim control over their own country, the left predicts a catastrophe? Perhaps it's because they fear a nation capable of independent thought. Be sure to comment below. Give a like and subscribe. This is just the beginning. Stay tuned for the next one.